All right, let's do this. Mexico travel tips. I have traveled all over this country. I have also traveled in different ways. So I have gone backpacking and I've been on road trips. So based on this, let me share with you the most important things that you should know before you travel in Mexico. Whether you're planning a holiday or thinking of an adventure trip in Mexico, I'll cover all the essential things here. To make things more fun and to add some travel inspiration to this video, in between I'll also share some quick impressions of places I really like, which are mostly from my last two trips that focused on the center and south of Mexico. Growing up as a kid in the Netherlands, I had this stereotypical image of Mexico. I thought it was just flat deserts with cacti. When Mexico showed up in movies or TV shows, that's what you would see. And it's true that in the north, you can see that landscape a lot. But actually, Mexico is extremely geographically diverse. So you might find yourself on a beautiful coastline, like here on the Pacific coast. And then you may find yourself here in the mountains, among the pine trees, where it's actually very cold. And before you know it, you're in a place like this. These hot, steamy jungles that you'll find, for example, in the state of Chiapas. But in general, we can actually say that Mexico is a very mountainous country. Sometimes you don't even notice it so much. For example, in the capital, Mexico City, you're actually at an elevation of about 2,200 meters, which isn't so obvious at first because it's a plateau, but you're actually very high up. The same is true for other cities like Oaxaca, Guadalajara, and many others. So unless you're only going on a beach vacation, it is a good idea to pack some warm clothing as well, because probably you'll spend some time up in the mountains. By the way, I think an underrated aspect of Mexico is its potential for hiking and trekking. What you're seeing here are the mountains around the Pueblos Mancomunicados. This is a collection of indigenous villages near Oaxaca that have created a network of hiking trails. If you love the outdoors, then this area is amazing. But this is just one of the many places you can go. Okay, so where to travel in Mexico? Maybe you already have a beach in mind like this, but there are many places to check out, like cities, nature, beaches. So it really depends on what you're looking for. Something that's useful to know is that most of the big cities are concentrated in the center of Mexico. And that's been the case basically since the Aztec times, because most of the fertile lands have always been in the center, and therefore it could support larger populations. The center of Mexico is therefore a great place to go for a city hopping trip. There's the capital, Mexico City, which I've done a whole video on, and it's an incredible city. Highly recommend spending some time there. But there are many others in the center of Mexico, like Guadalajara, Guanajuato, Morelia, and Puebla, and many others. So if you're into architecture and cuisine and museums and things like that, then this region is really great to check out. If you're looking more for beaches, then I think the obvious place to go is, for example, the Yucatan Peninsula, which includes the Yucatan State and Quintana Roo. You can do amazing snorkeling and scuba diving. You can dive into cenotes, which are kind of river caves. But you can also have a little bit of culture there. You can go to Mérida, which is a wonderful city. And yeah, you can get a little bit of everything, but mostly you'll probably be focused on the beaches, on the nature activities there. And finally, if you want a bit of a mix of everything, then an itinerary that I really like is to go from Mexico City to Oaxaca, the city at the center of Oaxaca State, and then go to the coast here. You will have a really nice mix of things. The coast here is not as developed as in the Yucatan, so it's a bit more laid back, which is cool. Oaxaca is known as the culinary capital of Mexico. It's a really great first city to check out if it's your first time in Mexico. So
If you're not sure where to go and want a bit of everything, then that itinerary works really well. If you have at least 2 weeks or something, I'm sure you will love it. There are many more itineraries to consider. I've just only mentioned the most obvious ones. But if you want to know more, I have a whole article, a whole guide that I'll put a link to in the description below.
Chances are that your flight will be to the capital, in which case it's definitely worth spending a few days here. I think Mexico City surprises a lot of people. It's an absolutely enormous city, but it can also be delightfully intimate and walkable and even relaxing. The museums in Mexico City are incredible and the city has a great vibe.
Besides where to travel, you might also wonder about when to travel in Mexico. Of course, this is a really big country, so the best times kind of depend on where you're going. So you'll probably want to research specifically the states that you're planning to visit. But just really generally, the high season tends to be in December and January for international tourists. I like to be in Mexico slightly outside of that time period. So I've been here in February and March, and now I'm here in October, November. I like these times. They're more like the shoulder season. Things are a little bit more chill in those months. A time to avoid really on the coasts is the summer. July, August, it just gets super hot. I don't know if it's recommendable. In terms of special times of the year, special events you may want to consider, there's Day of the Dead at the beginning of November, which a lot of people want to witness.
Even though it's called Day of the Dead, it actually takes place over many different days. It's a very colorful and festive time to be in Mexico. Oaxaca is often mentioned as the place to witness it, but be aware that hotels in Oaxaca get booked out very far in advance. Day of the Dead is celebrated all over the country though, so you have many other options. Last year, I actually went to this small village where they have a big Day of the Dead party and have their own unique take on the celebration. Another incredible thing to do if you're in Mexico at the right time is to see the monarch butterfly colonies. The butterflies come here by the millions to overwinter, and you can see them in several sanctuaries in central Mexico. The best time to do this is between November and March.
Another small but important point about when to visit, actually during your trip, be aware of the weekends, because a lot of domestic tourists will visit popular sites on the weekends. These include archaeological sites, museums, popular hikes. So what I like to do is to put the bigger sites during the week, because it'll be a little bit more chill. Of course, if it doesn't work out that way for you and you only have limited time, then go do those things on the weekend. But if you want to optimize things a little bit, avoid the weekends if you can. It'll be nice.
One more thing about where to travel. If you enjoy going to charming towns, then you need to know about the Pueblos Mágicos. These are now almost 200 villages all over Mexico that have received a special designation. This is usually because they are historical towns or they have some unique cultural aspect.
So sometimes when you're wondering, what else could I check out in this region, you can just look at a map of all the Pueblos Mágicos and see if there's any nearby. Some of them are like super on the travel trail. Others are relatively little known, but usually the Pueblos Mágicos are fun to check out. In fact, I am in one right now, a town called Mitla that is close to Oaxaca.
Speaking of the Pueblos Mágicos, the town of San Cristobal de las Casas is a favorite of many travelers who make their way through southern Mexico. It has one of the highest indigenous populations with around a dozen local languages spoken. But it's also home to an odd mix of foreign residents who have all brought their different cuisines and cultures with them, and it gives San Cristobal a wonderful, eclectic atmosphere. It's one of those towns with a lot of charm and soul that's highly worth stopping by if you're traveling through this part of the country.
All right, it's time. Let's address the elephant in the room, the one thing that everyone wants to know about when it comes to Mexico, which is where to find the best tacos. Actually, my producer is telling me it is safety. Everyone wants to know about safety when it comes to Mexico. Maybe I'll share some more safety tips later on, but here's how to think of it in general. I think I see a huge difference in perception between those who have been to Mexico and those who have not. So when I mentioned to someone random before this trip that I was going here, they were like, whoa, dude, don't you know about the cartels? And then when I talk to a travel friend, they'll be like, oh, cool, where are you going? So here's the thing. Mexico is a huge country. It's a federation comprising of 32 different states. If you overlay Mexico on a map, for example, a map of Europe, it will stretch all the way from about Ireland to Turkey. Now, why is that relevant? Well, there are some states where a lot of the bad news comes from, and these can even be dangerous places to go, but much of the rest of Mexico is fine as long as you take normal precautions. So in the same way that you wouldn't avoid going to Florida, for example, because you heard some bad things going on in Montana, you have to apply the same kind of mindset to Mexico. So there are maps out there that show you the relative safety of different areas in Mexico, but in general you can say that the areas around the capital are a good bet. The south and southeast has long been much safer than the rest of Mexico. So if it is your first time going here, then you can make things a lot easier for yourself by going to these areas which tourists love and where you have far fewer worries.
Speaking of worry-free, the city of Oaxaca is a great place to go, especially for a cultural trip to Mexico. I love how walkable Oaxaca is and how wonderfully well preserved its historical center is, with mostly low-rise buildings from the colonial era. Besides the old churches and small museums, there are also some great sites in the surrounding area, such as the ancient ruins of Monte Alban. Oaxaca is also known for its cuisine, especially the moles, complex sauces involving dozens of ingredients. All this makes Oaxaca City a great destination for a first-time Mexico trip.
I'm on the way to the bus station, which seems like a nice moment to talk about how exactly you can travel around Mexico, because there are many different ways. All right, so your first option really is to travel by coach bus. So here's the station, OCC, that is a brand of a big bus company. ADO is another one. Actually, all these brands belong to the same company. They're all owned by ADO. They have connections all over Mexico. This is a first-class terminal. These are for kind of coach bus trips between major points. You also sometimes have a second-class bus terminal, which is more for like regional trips, and those buses tend to be not so great. But if you travel on the first-class buses, they're going to be comfortable, they're going to be modern, so it's a great way to travel around. Now you can book tickets online. There are sites like Bookaway or BusBud where you can do that. These are third-party sites. Sometimes they don't list every connection in my experience. Another option that you have is to download the ADO app. ADO, like I mentioned, owns a whole bunch of other bus companies as well, so they have a lot of options available. And with the app, you can book your ticket, and then you get a PDF with like a QR code, and you're all set. One thing I would say is that the night buses in Mexico are not actually night buses, like they're just normal buses that happen to go at night. In other countries, for example in Peru, you can get buses that actually have almost bed-like seats that recline all the way back. And like in Vietnam, there are night buses where you can actually be totally horizontal. That doesn't seem to exist in Mexico. Another option, of course, for longer distances is to fly. And luckily there are a number of domestic carriers that can fly around Mexico pretty cheaply and conveniently. The only thing I would say is that they're not so transparent with their prices, especially Volaris. If you go on their site, it'll seem really cheap, and then you get to the final step before paying, and then suddenly they add the airport taxes to your price. And that can easily double the total. I don't know of any other company that does that actually. That seems super sneaky, but yeah, that's what they do. You can use Google Flights to do your flight research, because there, as far as I've seen, the kind of final price is shown rather than the kind of fake price that Volaris puts on its own website, at least initially. You can also get your own transportation. For example, you can decide to rent a car, and in some of the tourist-friendly states, doing a road trip there is definitely a great option. Maybe avoid driving at night, but in general, it can be safe and convenient. And the only thing I would remind you of is to pay attention to the roads and look for topes, which is the Spanish word for speed bump. Now, in Mexico, they have an absolute addiction to speed bumps. There are billions of them, and they're not always so well indicated. They don't always put a sign there, or they don't paint it in a different color. So you have to really pay attention, or otherwise you'll fly through the air at some point. But other than that, the main roads are in pretty good condition. So that is always a great option. If you're going to do like a big road trip through Mexico, which I've done before, and you're going to kind of remote areas or places that people don't often go, you might want to do your research. There's some parts in the north and on the Pacific coast that aren't always so safe. To learn a bit more about this, you can go to Facebook groups for overland travelers in Mexico. They have a lot of great information. And you can use the app iOverlander, which has all kinds of warnings. For example, if there are blockades or criminals or stopping cars or things like that, that can happen in some parts of Mexico, then you will be informed on that. I personally love to rent scooters or motorbikes. I do that especially in Asia, where that is really common. It's not quite as common here, but you do find scooter rentals in some towns. And this is a nice way to have a bit more freedom and to explore some villages in the area. The prices definitely aren't as low as in Asia, for example. It's not super low budget, but it can add a different way to travel to your trip. Trains are not really a thing so much in Mexico. There are two exceptions though. One, you have the Copper Canyon railway line, which is incredible. It goes through like Wild West looking sceneries, deserts with cacti, epic canyons. It's one of the most beautiful train rides you can do. It's kind of in an area with questionable safety, but that train line itself is pretty safe. And next year, at least people expect it to open next year in 2024, there will be a Maya train, which is a new train line that goes all around the Yucatan Peninsula. And this promises to be another kind of convenient way to travel around there. And finally, we have local transportation. Something you find in a lot of places are colectivos, which are minivans that go to different places around, villages or other destinations. They wait until there are enough passengers to fill the whole van, and then they go. So it's not on a schedule, it's more kind of improvised. You will need to ask people where they live, or use the Maps.me app, which is a great app anyway. On that app, you can see like the departure points for colectivos in towns. This is a more local way to travel. It helps a little bit to know some Spanish, I think. But yeah, it is a very cheap way to get to various sites. Inside the cities, it depends what city you're in. But some of them have Uber, for example. Mexico City has it. But then other cities don't have it, or they have another ride-hailing app, or none at all. So whether you should take taxis or ride-hailing, it kind of depends on the specific destination.
I mentioned Chiapas briefly in the beginning, but let me highlight it here again because it is one of my favorite states to travel in Mexico. It has the lowland jungles where you can see some of the country's most spectacular waterfalls. And you can visit Mayan temples that are hidden deep in the rainforest. In the Chiapas highlands, you can see very different landscapes, and one of the most stunning sights here is the Sumidero Canyon, which you can see on a boat trip down the Grijalva River.
While I'm enjoying a lovely view here in the town of San Cristobal, let me get through a couple more practical tips that you may wish to know. Firstly, money. How do you pay for things? Well, in Mexico, it is a good idea not to rely just on bank cards or credit cards because they may not be accepted everywhere. In particular, local restaurants or taxi drivers or these kind of things, there you may need cash. Now, the way to get cash out is to go to an ATM, and if you go to an ATM, make sure you pay attention to the fees. For example, for me, when I take money out here, the bank BBVA charges insane amounts of money. Like they charge like $10 or 10 euros for every transaction, which is crazy. Most other banks seem to charge about 30 pesos, which is a lot more reasonable. That's like $1.50 or €1.50.
As far as tipping goes, it's a common practice, but maybe not quite as much as in the US. You can generally tip around 10%, though many people do have low salaries, so you could decide to tip more if you'd like.
Nowadays, I know Spanish pretty well, so it makes traveling quite a lot easier. But when I started traveling in Latin America 10 years ago, I didn't know anything, so I remember what it was like then. The reality is that for all kinds of practical matters, it's not really such an obstacle. In hotels or hostels, they will generally know what you want. It's probably a bed to sleep in, Wi-Fi, these kind of things. So either they will be able to speak to you in English, or using keywords, they will know what you want. But of course, it helps a lot if you know the language. It adds more depth to your trip, and even just knowing some basic phrases can help you a lot. So if you want to be a bit more prepared, then before your trip you can learn a couple of phrases so that also you show good intention. People will appreciate it if you know a few words in their language. Another really important practical point is not to drink the tap water. There are a few exceptions, but in general the tap water is not safe to drink. Instead, you should drink bottled water. In terms of food safety, I guess you can use your own judgment. I just eat everything at this point. Street food, fancy restaurants, it doesn't matter. I will eat it as long as it looks okay. I do remember the first time I went to Latin America, I went to Peru, and on the first day I had stomach issues. So maybe you want to take a little bit more care depending on how you fare normally with these things. As far as toilet issues go, there is a common thing you'll find here, which is that they ask you not to flush anything, no toilet paper. That is normal. That's just how the sewage pipes work here. It's not unique to Mexico. For example, you can find that same issue in Greece, just to name a country. I've seen people freak out in hotel reviews saying they told us not to flush things. That's crazy. No, that's just totally normal. One thing to know about toilets, if you're looking at the doors, you may see an M on the door. That doesn't mean men, that means mujeres, and that means women in Spanish. All right, as a bonus, let me talk a little bit more about safety tips and safety issues. I generally don't like to talk about this very much because it's a complex issue, and I think sometimes travel bloggers are also not the best at conveying all the information. I try to get my information from many different sources, so hopefully I can give you at least a decent take on this. Something that's useful to know is that your experience as a tourist is going to be very different from the experience of a local or someone who has a business in Mexico, or even a foreign resident. They're gonna have different experiences than you will have, and if you're interested in knowing how things really work in Mexico, you can kind of pull that thread a little bit and you can ask people about it, and you might hear some interesting stories, let's say, and it's clear that organized crime does have its tentacles all over Mexican society. It is a real thing. As a tourist, you just won't notice so much because it generally happens in the background. It's kind of an invisible thing to you as you travel, especially in these safer states. So what you should be thinking about in these safer areas of Mexico is not maybe the more extreme forms of crime, but things like theft, for example. So you want to take basic precautions that you would take probably anywhere if you travel. Don't flaunt your wealth. Don't bring your Rolex, don't bring your pearls. You may want to keep your money and your cards in a separate wallet somewhere. These are little things you can do just to de-risk things a little bit. As for walking the streets at night, these are situations where maybe you want to take a taxi. That is what taxis are for. The best option is to use ride-hailing apps, as those are the safest. Otherwise, be sure to check how to take official taxis in the destination that you are. It may involve having someone call a taxi or going to an official taxi rank, which is better than just hailing a random taxi on the street.
By the way, I'm generally not a huge fan of the information that's put out by the US State Department, which in the colors that they use and the layout and the wording, it's just one of the most extreme takes you can find usually. And this is often a subject of conversation among travelers, how over the top their information can be. I personally like to look at what's provided by the UK Foreign Office, which tends to be a bit more level-headed and reasonable.
And the final piece of advice is really to say to be aware of some of the high-risk areas, but not to, get stuck on researching safety information, because it'll go through your head and then you'll have a completely incorrect picture of what it's like to travel around Mexico as a tourist, which again is different from living somewhere and being aware of some of the deeper issues. Usually all it takes is like a nice trip to, for example, the Yucatan or Mexico City or Oaxaca State, and then you realize, oh, I can just travel here and it is safe if I just take basic precautions, and you'll have a very different image of Mexico, I'm sure.
Finally, let me just say that if you enjoy going off the beaten path, you can definitely do so without having to go into unsafe regions of Mexico. There are actually lots of places that are not very touristy at all, where you can have wonderful adventures. And I invite you to check out my channel, where I have videos about quite a few such places. This video has taken quite a bit of time to put together, so if it has been helpful to you, I'd be very grateful for your like, your comment, or maybe you even want to subscribe. And with that, I wish you an incredible time in Mexico.